Hey guys, and I'm really excited today to be bringing you the in-depth analysis of game number 2 of 5 of my 2024 SPC Finals match against fellow Grandmaster Ian Weinstein. Game 1 was really exciting. Definitely make sure you check that out. It was posted yesterday if you haven't already. Ian ended up winning that game by a narrow margin of 9 points, so he is up 1-0 in our best of 5 match going into this game. So I am definitely feeling some pressure and some urgency to get a W here. Will I be able to? Let's see. Ian was first, and he had this rack to start, EEHIJMR. He noticed that he's an N away from a truly bizarre-looking 8-letter word min here, MIJNHEER. But of course, no N available on the board, so Ian needs to find another option. It's a deceptively awkward opening rack, and Ian rightfully spent a good amount of time here, around 2 minutes. The problem is, he'd really love to get rid of his J, since it's a bit of a clunky tile and it's going to hinder him from bingoing early in the game, but there are really no good plays that do it. Jeer for 22, which Ian eventually played, is the best play that gets rid of his J. Options that keep the J are also not that appealing. The best of those would be Rehem, which does score 4 more, 26 points, but keeps IJ. It also gives back a lot more to me in terms of floaters for bingos and also scoring opportunities. So because of all that, Ian settled on Jeer, which I agree is the best play, the commentators agreed, and also computer simulation backs up. So a good start for Ian. He takes a 22-0 lead. Now, on my turn here, the good news is I had the blank. The bad news is I had a lot of consonants to go with it, and there aren't a lot of great plays here. I need to obviously hold on to my blank and try to get rid of as many of these consonants as I reasonably can to hopefully set myself up for a bingo on my next turn. I made what appears to be the best play of Feet, F-Y-T-T-E, for 15 points to the second E in Jeer. Another option would be Petty, but this scores 1 fewer point, only getting 14, and the F is a much worse bingo tile than the P, so this looks like the best play by a pretty clear margin. Ian had a pretty interesting decision on this turn. He made a point sacrifice here. The highest scoring play is Hijab for 31 through the A in Jeer, and he played the same exact tiles, making the word Baji, which scores 6 fewer points, getting him 25 instead of 31. I'm pretty sure the logic is that Baji is slightly more defensive, because after Hijab, the S-hook is a lot more dangerous, since I could potentially hit 1 or even 2 double word scores with a bingo with Hijabs. It also allows me to bingo down the E column from E1 to E7 fairly easily. Whereas after Baji, it's a little bit trickier for me to get a bingo down. Personally, I don't think I would have sacrificed the 6 points here. It's a bit to give up this early in the game, but I definitely understand where Ian was coming from with this decision. As it turns out, this decision did pay some dividends for Ian, because if he had played Hijab, I would have had the very nice Cyprinid through the Y in Feet with a blank D for 78 points, which I was preparing to play. The good news, though, is I did still have bingos playable on this turn with my rack of CIINPR blank. 2 sevens played down the E column, either Pricing or Porcini. I saw both of these quickly and eventually went for Pricing just because the blank G in Pricing is a lot less scary to put between 2 triple word scores than the I in Porcini, especially since the I, if I were to play Porcini, would be next to the double letter score, so Ian could easily have something with the Z or even the X there for 60 to 70 points. So Pricing, definitely the safer option here. That's what I went with. I take an 89 to 47 lead. Ian's next rack is also a little bit clunky. He's got a lot of vowels to go along with his Y, including 2 I's. A number of options are reasonable here. From the F in Feet, he can play either Fomally or Family. Through the blank G in Pricing, he can play either Gamely or Goyim, or he could play in neither of these spots, going with Isoli for 28 through the C in Pricing. All of these options are reasonable, and Ian ended up going with Family from the F for 28. I do think Fomally is slightly better just because it scores 2 more points and gets rid of an extra vowel. It's possible that Ian wasn't positive that Fomally was valid. It makes sense as a word. It would mean in a foamy manner, but the ILY words are a notoriously tricky bunch to keep track of in terms of their validity. If someone tells you there's a word in these 7 tiles, like I said, it's not hard to see Fomally and guess that sure, it reasonably could be a word. But a lot of ILY words you'd think would be valid are not valid, so definitely, if Ian wasn't sure of this, it makes sense not to take the risk, since the difference between playing Family and losing a turn is way larger than the difference between playing Family and Fomally. Gamely down here is also a reasonable option, as is Goyim, like I said before, but I think it makes sense to leave the board open if you're Ian, since he's still down some points and a tempo here. So I think this is the right idea, just maybe a slightly inferior execution to Fomally, but certainly not a big mistake by any means. I drew poorly after my bingo, pulling a Q, a D, and the Old MacDonald set, E-I-E-I-O. Rarely a good thing in Scrabble. Pretty much forced here, I think, is Chi for 24 points. There's no other way to get rid of my Q here that makes any sense. I could trade and keep something like ED, but to me, 24 points, especially since it does have some defensive merit, blocking the G on the bottom for the most part, is worth it. This leave is not good, but if I can draw 1 or 2 consonants, it's at least salvageable. So this seems like the right call by me. I'm still up by 38 points. A very clunky rack for Ian after his play of family. He's got 3 pairs of duplicates, 2 Ds, 2 Os, and 2 Ts, along with an I. He spent a while here, eventually going with the fairly uninspiring option of dot for 17 points. Now, I say uninspiring just because scoring only 17 points and keeping a mediocre leave of DIOT is just not very exciting. I don't say uninspiring because this is a bad play. The reason it's not a bad play is because none of the options are anything but uninspiring. His highest scoring play appears to be odd for 20 points above the YN family, only getting 3 more points, keeping a worse leave with the duplicated T's, and also throwing a D between 2 triple word scores, which is very risky. So this is definitely a worse option. The other option I believe Ian strongly considered was a bit different, blowing up his rack entirely with Ridado from the RNGer for 10. This is a point sacrifice, giving up 7 points to the 17-point dot. The advantage, though, is that he cleans up his rack a little more, keeping just a D, and also turns over more tiles. As you guys can see, there is still a blank left. There are still 4 S's left, as well as some valuable scoring tiles like the X and the Z. All of these are tiles Ian would really like to get, and playing 6 tiles instead of 3 will double his chances at getting them. So this is also a reasonable option. That being said, I think dot is fine. DIOT is not a great leave, but it's not a terrible leave. He also has the O to hook Oda on the second row for future turns. So, like I said, not the most exciting play to make, but I think this is a reasonable decision here on Ian's side. So I'm still up. I draw actually not too poorly after Chi. My rack here is not good, but if you recall, I did keep 4 vowels and a D, so I can't reasonably be expecting to have a good rack. The S was definitely a nice pickup. I have some options here that do spend the S. I could play something like ours or doers through the R in pricing, hooking Bajis. I ended up going with guide for 15 though, just because keeping the S is pretty useful here. I still have the S hook on Jeers, and it could be very useful in the long run if I'm able to make a setup for myself for future bingos or high scoring plays. So I think this is probably reasonable at this stage, but you could also, like I said, make an argument for cashing it immediately. If these plays didn't keep leaves that were so clunky, like EIU after doers, I actually probably would do it, just because there are still 3 S's unseen, but I really didn't want to keep EIU at this important juncture in the game, so I decided to make a pretty big sacrifice here and play guide, which generally people seem to agree with. I'm still up by 36, holding an S, so my position still feels fairly solid. And on this turn, Ian drew an S of his own as well as the X, and he pretty quickly played XI for 40 points. This, I do believe, is a bit of a mistake, as there are some sneaky plays available through the first E in Jeer, best of which appears to be Ilex for 50 points. This scores 10 more points than Ian's play and also gets rid of his L. You'll notice that XI keeps the same leave as Ilex in addition to the L, and this makes it a little bit more consonant heavy, so Ilex here almost certainly a better play. Ian was in a bit of time pressure though after spending a while on his complicated turns of Baji and Dot, so he probably wanted to try to make up for that a little bit and play this turn quickly, so certainly an understandable miss, not the easiest play to see by any means, but I do think this is a clear mistake on his part. That being said, he retakes the lead here, he's up by 4 points, and I am still stuck with 5 vowels on this turn. There's really not a whole lot of great options here. I obviously want to get rid of one of my O's and one of my E's. I'd love to also get rid of a third vowel if I can, but there's just no good way to do that. I could play the word Aeon, A-E-O-N, in several spots, the highest scoring of which is up here, which I briefly considered, but that just gives back way too much counterplay to Ian by putting the E directly below the triple word score at the top middle of the board. So that was pretty quickly ruled out as an option. Once again, I could cash in the S with Arsino for 28 through the R in pricing. I think this is fine, but my rack is good enough that I decided to try to go for a bingo one more turn, playing Obey for 18 points, keeping A-E-N-O-S, figuring there are still more consonants than vowels unseen at this point, 34 consonants, 23 vowels. If I can draw 2 consonants or even a consonant and a vowel, I should be in decent shape next turn and often be able to fit a bingo on this board. So I don't love fishing normally, playing off just 1 or 2 tiles for a small score, but I think given how lackluster my non-fishing options here are, this is probably reasonable. It's worth mentioning another option I did briefly consider that plays off the same tiles for 4 fewer points is OE above the Y in family for 14. The idea here is trying to set up a line down the O column for my S if I can draw a bingo hooking OES. It's an interesting idea, but I didn't feel like it was a risk I needed to take at this point, because it's still basically an even game. I have plenty of other places on this board to bingo, and with 3 S's still unseen, I could also be giving Ian a very high-scoring play or bingo of his own. So if the score were a little different, it's a risk I probably would have taken, but Obey felt reasonable at this point in the game. Ian did draw a bingo on his turn after XI. He has the word toddles, which plays in several spots. The highest scoring is worth 74, playing above guide on the 14 row. It's very dangerous, though, putting an S between 2 triple word scores. It's especially dangerous from Ian's perspective because I just played off 2 tiles for only 18 points. That strongly suggests I'm keeping a good bingo lead, so the last thing Ian wants to do, especially since he'll be taking a sizable lead with this play, is give me an S in wide open space to bingo to, or maybe even triple through. So that's definitely not Ian's best option. Another play would be toddles over here for 71, shifting it a couple spots to the left. That's a little bit less dangerous from a bingo perspective, but it gives back large scoring plays on the 15 row under the E and the S. If I say have a W for EW or an F for EF, and then a 4-letter word horizontally there, I could easily score 50 points, and that is not going to be a great outcome for Ian. So he decides on his lowest scoring, but I agree, best option of playing toddles for 69 points with guides. This is a much safer play. It doesn't really give back any big scoring plays. It does give back some horizontal bingo lines for 8s through the Ds as well as the L, maybe even the O, but those are a bit harder to hit since those tiles need to be in a fairly specific spot around the middle of the word to fit. So definitely a lot less risky, all things considered, than his other options. By far and away his best option here, a very smart decision by Ian, if you ask me, and any of the computers. So Ian takes a 55-point lead, and I drew poorly after Obey, about the worst draw I could have asked for, pulling 2 more O's, resulting in triplicate O's along with A, E, and S. I was definitely feeling a little bit deflated here. The game had been going fairly well for me, and just in the span of a turn or two, all of a sudden I was very much on my back foot. But these kind of things happen a lot in Scrabble, and it's important to not dwell on it too much and focus on finding your best play each and every rack. And I'm very proud of the play I made in this position. There aren't a lot of particularly exciting options here. My best equity play appears to be new for 17 next to the ODD and toddles, but AEOS is still a bit too vowel heavy, and it doesn't really accomplish all that much, because Ian can now just play down the L column parallel to the word I just made, making a bunch of 3s, and that's going to score very well, and also leave me not a lot to work with on this board. So instead, I made a slight equity sacrifice, playing Axion through the XI on the board on the 5 row. It scores more, it scores 22 points, but it keeps a worse leave, as the duplicate O's are not great. But the key idea here is I set up Axions and possible bingos or high-scoring plays down the O column. And I was aware that there were 2 S's still left, so it is a risk. Obviously, Ian could have pulled an S after his bingo and have a big play there. But if Ian doesn't have an S, it's very annoying for him to block. And if he does block, he probably has to sacrifice a significant amount to do so. Being down 55 points and having a bad rack, I felt now was the time I needed to take a little bit of a risk. If I just play passively, like I said, with something like New, it really allows Ian to start controlling the board and taking a stranglehold on this game. So I really felt like I needed to be proactive here and make sure this board wasn't going to start getting walled in. I really like this play. It didn't work out for me that well, as you guys will see, but I think this was the right decision and a necessary risk to take. As it turns out, this was a great time to make this play, as Ian not only didn't have an S, he didn't have any vowels. He did have the blank, but there's really no good plays using the blank, so it doesn't make sense to spend it here. And he has a couple options that don't involve exchanging, such as Brand for 11 on the 7 row, but that keeps the very clunky MV combo together. So since that's only 11 points, it's not worth it. His best play, as he determined, is to exchange. He ended up trading 5, keeping N blank. I think this is totally reasonable. You could make an argument for keeping R blank, maybe even MR blank, but I think here turning over more tiles makes sense just because Ian would really like to get one of those 3 S's for the Axions hook if I'm unable to make a good play there on my next turn. R blank versus N blank is close. Ian, I believe, mentioned he kept N blank just because he noticed there are only 2 N's left to him, whereas there are 3 R's, so the N stands a slightly lower chance of getting duplicated. I think it's really close here. This is the kind of decision that, again, if you ask different top players, they might tell you a different answer. It's such a close call either way that I think the biggest mistake you could make here is spending a really long time, like more than a minute, debating which of these is better. And Ian did not do that. He made this exchange very quickly, so I think this is a very prudent decision on his part. Get rid of some tiles, hope for a better rack on his next turn. I unfortunately did not have a good draw after my play of Axion, pulling 2 more vowels, the E and the U, out of the bag along with an L. and I very reluctantly played Olios for 31 points here. And I say reluctantly because, yes, it's nice to still be able to score 31 and then load a bunch of my vowels, but I really didn't want to use that Axion setup for a 31-point play. I really wanted a high-scoring play there, or ideally a bingo. The problem is there's just no good options here that don't involve using that spot. If I play something like hours on the left, it defeats the purpose of the Axion setup because now I'm getting rid of my S, and it might actually start benefiting Ian more than me because he just turned over 5 tiles, and with 2 more S's still unseen, he might be the favorite to hit it instead of me. So I definitely don't want to do something like this. A play like OE for 13 just doesn't keep a good enough leave to justify. ELOSU is not that bingo prone. So I think this is the right call here, and I'm actually not really down after this play, because it'll be a 2-point lead for Ian after Olios, plus a turn of course, but that's not that big a deficit. It's certainly not insurmountable without a bingo, so I think this is the right call. Take some points, take out this spot for Ian, hope for some more consonants on the next turn. Like I said, not a decision I really wanted to make, but it felt kind of forced in this position. Ian drew very well after his exchange, and he made a really, really nice play here. He has a bunch of available 7 and 8 letter bingos. He could play something like Inhalos for 70 on the 2 row. He could play Ladrones for 70 on the 12 row through the D, but he finds by far his best option here a disconnected 9 letter bingo through the C and the D, Colanders for 74 points. Canoodles would also have fit for 74 on that row. The difference between the two is negligible. But either way, very, very nice board vision and word finding by Ian here. He played this very quickly. Great find. He takes a 76-point lead. And I finally managed to get a rack that had fewer than 5 vowels, but unfortunately I pulled the dreaded UW combo, which is one of the worst 2-tile combinations in Scrabble. So I knew I needed to find a way to get rid of that combination. I also knew that I needed to find a way to open the board, because there isn't a whole lot of space to bingo. The first option I saw was outsaw for 20 points through the S and Colanders. This cleans up my rack beautifully, like I said, getting rid of both the U and the W and keeping the nice EP leave. But the problem is, there's really nowhere for me to bingo on the board after outsaw. It's super important for me to keep the R and the S and Colanders open, since being down 76 points with a bad rack, there's basically no way I'm coming back and winning this game without bingoing. Right now, the left-hand side of the board is the part of the board that feels like it's the most easily able to be opened. The bottom right, like I said, is already fairly open because of the R and the S, and I'd like to keep it that way. But there's a lot of space down the A, B, and C columns, as well as on the 1, 2, and 3 rows in the top left part of the board, where I could potentially fit a 7-letter bingo. So I decided to create some more space over there by playing POW for 21 points. At the minimum, even if I'm not that likely to hit the P on this turn, it might distract Ian and induce him to block over there, and then I'd have another shot to hit the R and the S on the bottom right. I need to be proactive here, because like I said, if I play something like outsaw, or if I just play something on the top right, like Paw, which does score 8 more points than POW, then Ian is a strong enough and smart enough player that he's going to just block the R and the S here, realizing he'll be going up 70 points on a completely dead board. Any opening I create at that point, he can just close in sort of cat and mouse fashion. I need to make sure that at the end of every turn I make, if at all possible, there are at least 2 openings on different parts of the board, so that Ian will not be able to simultaneously block them on his turn. Against computer opponents, you can often be less proactive and just leave a single bingo line open, since they tend to be a little bit less adept at defense and blocking. However, against a human player that's as strong as Ian, I can't afford to do that. Interestingly, the computer simulation from the Macondo engine does still prefer Paul on the top right, which, like I said before, does score 8 more points than POW, which is significant. But I still stand by my decision to play POW. I think the computer sim is probably underestimating how likely Ian is to play defensively from here on out, and I need to make this kind of play to ensure that I at least have some chances to hit a bingo with a good draw. In any case, after POW, Ian made another very nice play here, scoring well and blocking with Vares for 38 points through the R and pricing. This does keep ARR, which isn't a great leave, but it scores so many more points than his next best option, also starts exhausting space on the left-hand side of the board. This is by far Ian's best play, and he takes a 93-point lead. To make matters worse for me, I drew extremely poorly, pulling a second U and a second E along with the clunky F. And my chances here are definitely starting to slip away, and I make a fairly desperate play here of few and up for 20 points. I know it's desperate, but I think it is certainly warranted here. I'm down over 90 points, I have a terrible rack. Another thing to keep in mind, guys, in this game and throughout this series, is that spread is more or less irrelevant. This is a best-of-5 match. Ultimately, the winner is going to be who wins 3 games. It doesn't matter whether you go 3-2 plus 300 spread or 3-2 minus 300 spread. The only thing that matters here is winning games. If you lose, it doesn't matter if you lose by 2 or 200. Now, it's theoretically possible that spread could matter if Ian and I tie in this best-of-5 match. That being said, this is not chess. Ties are extremely rare in Scrabble, happening on average well less than 1% of the time. The number is, I think, around 1 in 250, 1 in 300 in tournaments. So given that, it's very unlikely that we're going to have a tie in this best of 5. So you should be playing in this match as if spread is irrelevant. So if it were earlier in the tournament, I might be a little bit more conservative with a play like few through the E and Jeer, which scores more but doesn't open anything and keeps an extra E. This is a little bit less likely to win than playing the more aggressive few, but it makes it a lot less likely that I'm going to lose by like 200 points. That being said, like I said, I don't care about that here. I want to be aggressive, force Ian to respond to this. I think this has to be the correct play in this context. And Ian was able to respond very nicely. He makes by far his best play of Fawner, scoring really well, reopening nothing, and keeping the Z for additional scoring plays on his next turn. Ian up 112 points, absolutely in the driver's seat at this point. I did finally manage to draw some consonants to go along with my vowels, but it's starting to feel a little bit too late to mount a comeback. Being down 112, I'm going to need not only a bingo, but a really high-scoring bingo in order to come back and win this game. Because of that, I decided to make a very aggressive play, going with Hut for 22 points under the S in Colanders. Now, this is extremely dangerous because it puts a T in between 2 triple word scores, and Ian could score a lot of points there. But I figured if I wanted any chance to win this game, a great way to do it would be playing a triple-triple bingo through that T, covering both of the triple word scores, scoring easily over 100 points. And it's unlikely, but it's not inconceivable that Ian might have a hard time blocking this, because I noticed it's a consonant-heavy pool. 13 consonants and 6 vowels remain unseen to me. So if somehow Ian has 7 consonants, which is, again, unlikely but not inconceivable, then it may be difficult or even impossible for him to block that T. And maybe, who knows, I can draw a triple-triple or other super high-scoring bingo through that T and mount a comeback. It's extremely unlikely to work, and it could result in me losing by a lot more points than I need to, but as I mentioned before, I don't care at this point if I lose, whether I lose by like 60 or by 200. It doesn't matter given the format of this match. So I'm willing to take the risk that Ian gets a huge play or a bingo of his own through that T, and I lose by 200. I'm willing to take that risk if it gives me even an outside shot like 1% to win this game. So I think this is a reasonable play. It's worth mentioning there are other options too. I considered Theka for 36 points along the second row. It scores a little bit more than Hut, but it just feels a little bit easier for Ian to block the top row. Since even if he has 7 consonants, he might not be able to have a play along the top row that gets to the triple word score at 1H, but he can play a 3-letter word through that A, and if he starts with a tile that's a clunky tile like a G or a V, it's going to be really hard for me to bingo from that tile. So it felt a little bit easier for Ian to address this opening. Also, the T you leave is considerably clunkier for me and less likely to bingo than ACET after Hut, so I feel like this is a reasonable try. Either way, I'm grasping at straws, probably looking at a win percentage of 1%, maybe a little bit less at this point in the game, but hey, crazier things have happened. Ian, though, had a very nice rack here, and he made a very nice play. Varmint for 39 to the T, scoring well, blocking that part of the board, keeping the Z. Fantastic play here, pretty much locks up the game. And at this point, there's really nothing left for me to do. I'm getting really low on time at this point, just from thinking so hard the last couple of turns, trying to conjure up a way to steal this game. At this point, I kind of recognize I can't win. I'm down to a couple seconds when I play Yak for 18 points from the YO. Probably something like Ko-Make for 30 is better through the OMA. I actually saw this, but figured with Yak, at least I leave one tile in the bag. I keep the E. By leaving one tile in the bag, Ian isn't going to be certain what my rack is. He'll know I have 7 out of 8 unseen tiles, but there'll be a little bit of uncertainty, so maybe there's something I can draw somehow that he doesn't block. I don't really know. I think at this point I'm completely lost either way. There's just really not all that much to be done. This game is going to go to Ian. So I'm going to go through the endgame now. Ian actually had Gauzier on this rack as a 7. It didn't play. He made by far his best and highest scoring play of Zeta through the D and Toddles for 45. And with A, E, G, G, and RT, again, it doesn't really matter at this point whether I play the optimal endgame, just because spread is more or less irrelevant. But, you know, I still want to play a pretty good endgame, and I did manage to do that. Playing Gan for 17 points on the top right corner. The idea with this is Ian is threatening to go out with Rubigo to the O and Olios if I don't block over there, so I definitely want to stop him from doing that. And again, as we'll see, also saves a very nice outplay for me on the next turn. After this, Ian should probably play something like Jibber through the E in titles because it blocks a high-scoring outplay I have. However, again, it doesn't really matter at this point. He was also low on time. He played Urbia for 9 on the left, blocking one of my outplays. I could have played Great through the A in Vares, so he blocked that. Presumably, he didn't see that I have Egret for 22 points from the E in titles. It's a little bit tricky, and like I said, doesn't really make that much of a difference given the format of this series, so all good there. Game ends with Ian winning 445 to 313, actually. I went over by a couple of seconds just from struggling to come up with good plays at the end, so I lost 10 points as a penalty. So 445, 313, the final score of this game, once again in favor of Ian. So with this win, guys, Ian takes a 2-0 lead in this best-of-5 match. And at this point, we took a rather lengthy lunch break, so I went into this lunch break, on one hand, feeling a little bit deflated since I knew I would need to beat Ian 3 games in a row to win this match and the title, which is certainly no easy task. But on the other hand, I knew I was playing pretty well. I feel like the first game, I made a bunch of great plays. This game was a bit rough with some of the vowels in the middle of the game, but I also think I gave myself the best shot I could. I think Axion was a really clever play. I was proud of that, even though it didn't quite materialize in the way I wanted it to. I think Pow and Few were reasonable efforts at the end. Again, Ian had the right tiles to block, executed his blocks very well, and I just couldn't make it happen. So a lot of credit to Ian for how he played these first couple of games. And like I said, I knew it was going to be a tough battle coming back, but I also knew I was playing good Scrabble, and I needed to focus on that fact and not focus on the fact that it was 0-2 from my perspective on the scoreboard. Just keep taking it one turn at a time in games 3 and hopefully 4 and 5 if I were able to win game 3 after lunch, and hopefully the tides would turn and I'd be able to get some wins. So that's kind of how I was operating in terms of my mindset at this point. I finished this game, went out for lunch with a couple of my good friends, had a really, really good ham sandwich at a restaurant a couple blocks away from the venue in South Bend, and came back around 2 o'clock in the afternoon ready for Game 3 and ready to just kind of see what would happen and take it each play and hope for the best result. So tomorrow I look forward to going over what happened in that Game 3 where I was facing elimination. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Really hope you're enjoying this series so far. Let me know what you think of this game in the comment section, and I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow for game number 3. Thanks again, guys. Really appreciate all your support. Take care. Bye-bye.